Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host Brian Keane, online fitness coach, nutritionist and 3-time best-selling author, here to help you by deconstructing an expert guest on all things health, fitness and mindset. Today's guest, we focus heavily on the mindset side of things and in the relationship side with former adult star Candice Horbacz. Candice, most commonly known as Eva Lovia, is a former adult entertainment star, one of the world's leading adult entertainment stars. She's over 2 million followers on her Instagram page, and she has a wonderful podcast, Chatting With Candice, where she breaks down things like differences in sexuality, porn in relationships, motherhood insights, divine feminine, apologies, and healed masculine. A lot of topics we cover in today's podcast. It's very difficult to pigeonhole Candice because she can talk so well on different topics. And in today's podcast, we go through a lot of how to show up in relationships, dealing with those insecurities, dealing with jealousy. If you're somebody that's a parent that has boys or girls, how to touch into that healed masculine, divine feminine, and not letting society put you into a box. So if you're struggling with those limitations, that self-worth, that self-love, that own biggest enemy living between your two ears, this is an episode that you are going to have so many aha moments, even in the conversation. And I've been listening to Candice's podcast for a while, particularly in preparation for this episode. I got so many aha moments as we went through it. So I'm going to be going back over it with a pen and a pencil myself, and then pulling on some of the threads of the things that connected me. So I highly recommend you do something similar. This was one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had in a very long time. Very similar to a recent episode with Charlie Webster, where I ended up getting a lot more from it on a personal standpoint than I even thought going in. So without further ado, here's today's wonderful chat with a great person who's doing great work, former adult star Candice Horbacz, on connecting with your own divine feminine / healed masculine, dealing with relationship insecurities, and not letting society put you into a box. Enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today with my guest, Candice Horbacz. Candice, most commonly known as Eva Lovia, is a former adult entertainment star, wife, mom, and podcast host. Candice is the type of woman you can't pigeonhole. In fact, the evolution in her career path has been a transformation. As mentioned, she's a former adult entertainment performer, an entrepreneur in the production and Web3 space, an organizer of spiritual retreats centered on psychedelics and wellness, a mother to 2 boys, a wife, and the podcast host of Chatting With Candice, which I'll link in the description for everybody to go check out off the back of this podcast. Her mission is to inspire people to expand their curiosity, think independently, and not be afraid of their own messiness. I'm looking forward to talking all things relationships, sexuality, and not putting yourself into a box. Candice, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. What an intro. Hopefully I live up to that during this episode. So nice to meet you, and thank you for having me on.
The pleasure is all mine. Candice, you were doing phenomenal work with the podcast. I actually came across you first with a mutual friend, Chris Williamson, on the Modern Wisdom podcast. And that's where I heard about you first. And again, as soon as I heard your team reaching out, I was like, yes, let's have this conversation. This will be a wonderful discussion. But before we get into it, because we've got a lot of different areas we're going to cover today, talk to us about your beginning over 10 years ago, because I think this gives us a nice little jumping off point to webcamming and getting a degree in psychology, because that kind of ties your kind of past self and to your story where you're at the minute. So let's jump into that and use that as a jumping off point.
Yeah, so I got into the adult industry starting with webcamming, like you mentioned. And I think that what people don't realize is there's like different little pockets of the industry, and there's very, very different, and the psychology behind it and how you interface with your customers or your fans is very different. So webcamming for me, you would think that it's very easy, very relaxing, quick way to make money and get your name out there. But for me, I didn't like kind of the energy exchange that was happening with webcamming. It's a lot of taking from the viewers. Like there's not really a real relationship being built. They're not really fans. It's not like community. It's more just like take. And then that became very draining for me. I didn't like being told what to do. It didn't really matter if someone was tipping or not. It's why partially why I got into the industry. I didn't want a boss. I didn't want to have someone tell me what to do or how to behave, or, I just don't like that kind of control. So I was like, this is not for me. And I kind of started to explore the film territory because that's where I knew I wanted to end up. So I kind of like pushed my way in by finding in certain companies that I really wanted to work with, and I liked the aesthetic. I thought a lot of it was real. It absolutely was not. So all of those reality websites, like not real, very scripted, which is good because you want to make sure everyone's tested and safe and all of that good stuff. I was pleasantly surprised about that. So I started with girl in film, and if you want to kind of reach the next caliber, you have to do boy girl film. It just is what it is. Like there's not a massive market for girl only film, and I kind of exhausted that outlet. So I mean, that transition was super difficult, and I know we want to get into relationships and all of that, and I've been with my now husband the entire trajectory of my career, so I feel like I have been to the depths, like as deep into like pain and questioning narratives and factory settings as much as you can with any one person. You know what I mean? Like we really tried that relationship in every possible way. So I have porn to thank for that, honestly, because I know that man will be there for me no matter what, and I'll be there for him no matter what. And we've like seen the most painful elements of each other, and like we were able to overcome a lot together. So for me, that was really beautiful.
With the relationship, and you mentioned there about factory settings and our programming, I know because you do a lot with psychedelic wellness, and again, I've been on ayahuasca retreats and I've experienced that myself, so I know that conditioning and programming gets questioned. With the relationship and your husband, and as you mentioned, you have a very positive reframe on it, that you have porn to thank for it, but what were some of the main issues that came up? Because when I think of relationships with my partner or with previous partners, you think jealousy, you think insecurity, you think all of these major things, which I would imagine are very heavily magnified when your other half is in the entertainment industry. What was the process for working through that?
So I find porn to be a great amplifier. It's almost like a psychedelic in itself, right? It forces you to look at painful things and areas that you kind of need to evolve and grow in, and there's no escaping. Once you make that decision, you're in it, similar to a psychedelic experience. Like once you've decided to take that journey, like you're there, and you kind of have to face your demons and your shadows and whatever that is. So a lot of us take jealousy and we write it off. We're like, we just accept that as part of being in a romantic relationship, and we don't question it. We don't ask if it's healthy, if the expression is healthy, if it's justified, if our partner has given us cause to maybe feel these things. If possibly it's there for some other reason. Maybe it's there because of the relationships that were modeled for you. Maybe were modeled in an unhealthy way. And then you're maybe now have a sense of control or ownership over a partner. That's not good either. So a lot of us don't question it. It was just like our default mode, and it's what we kind of expect. And we live in a culture that kind of says, yeah, that's okay. You're allowed to get jealous if she goes out with her girlfriends, or if she wears something that you find too revealing, or you're allowed to get jealous if he goes out with the guys and isn't texting you every 10 minutes. And I say like that's a really vulnerable and like fragile place to be in a relationship. Is that how strong your relationship is? Or do you want something that kind of can withstand a little bit more than that? I would hope so, right? Especially if you're talking about marriage. So when it comes to making the decision to get into porn, when you're literally having sex with somebody else, I mean, that's like the peak. That is the peak of experiencing jealousy, right? Like, and it's justified. In that case, it's absolutely justified. Like the person you love the most is being intimate with somebody else. And then we can kind of get into intimacy and sex, and are they one and the same, or can you kind of separate them? Because I do think that they're separate. But yeah, so it kind of made us decide, okay, well, what do we want jealousy to look like in our relationship? Do we want it to kind of take the wheel, or do we want to try to be in charge of that emotion? And then what do we want the boundaries in our relationship to be? So for us, it's kind of funny because my husband would always say he was never going to get married, never going to have kids. He was never going to find a partner that would be what he wanted and needed, because he didn't want to be monogamous. But he didn't know that wasn't like that other models existed, right? Like it's really rare, and I think it's becoming more popularized, but the idea of open relationships or monogamish or poly, like that's pretty new. So he just didn't know that women like that existed. And I was kind of the same way. Like I'm definitely an outlier when it comes to what I want sexually. I know most women want monogamy, and I think that that's fine and beautiful. I think that you just have to consciously make that decision, right? Like just don't fall into it. Just really sit with it, think about it, and customize your relationship, because even though it's monogamous, there's still going to be a lot of different elements and boundaries that you have that are not going to be the same for everyone else, because we're all individuals. So I think it just forced us to tailor our relationship. And then we kind of realized we can have a relationship that society maybe doesn't understand or agree with, but that makes sense for us, and that we can still honor our sacred union in a way that makes sense for us. So if it's death do us part, which I, certainly hope so, and we both have a different sexual appetite, or we want that possibility, how do we instill that into the relationship? So it's a ton of honest communication. It's me allowing space for him to express what he wants and needs to in that moment, because it was still new. It's not to say jealousy goes away. It's there forever. It's just how in control of it you are. So I can't get mad when he comes to me and he's like, listen, I watched your video, or someone sent me your video, and I don't like how it's making me feel, and I'm going to sit with that, lean into it, find the edges, and go deeper. So allowing that space back and forth, and then realizing it's not that bad. Like, it's, for us, the idea of him experiencing pleasure with someone else and him being able to see me and like my full sexual expression is exciting to me, and it's exciting to him. And I think we both changed our idea of what love is and what intimacy is, and I guess like the security within the relationship, and like those actions are not a threat to the relationship.
Yeah, consensual non-monogamy is the term I've heard you use there and on podcasts, and that you need to create a roadmap to your own customized relationship. I think that's so important. And the first thing that jumps to my mind, because I know people listening will be similar, you mentioned there that society doesn't understand that approach. Was that something you struggled with at any point, Candice? Because obviously one of your quotes, one of my favorite quotes from you is, people are eager to trap you in a box. I'm here to burn that box. Did you find it difficult initially to break out of that societal box or that societal norm, or is that something you had to work on, or is it something that you were just always okay with and just that's just you by nature, you're outside of the box thinking, or what has been your kind of evolution through that?
So I've always kind of been on the outside. I moved around a ton. I didn't have a lot of stability growing up, and I was super introverted. I hate being told what to do. If everyone's doing one thing, I'm like, why is everyone doing that? I want to do it this way. And it's not necessarily to be contrarian. Maybe sometimes it was that, you know what I mean? Especially when you're young and being rebellious. But like, I'm just more comfortable on the edges. I think that some people have more of that like vagabond, like, pirate cowboy lifestyle, and like that's what they want. I don't think that that's most people. So for me, it just seemed natural, and I've never been one to do things to appease other people. Like, if you can take me and like me, or you can dislike me, but that's not my business. You know what I mean? Like, what you think about me is not my business. I hope that I'm, a kind, generous, loving, good person. And if certain decisions that I make regarding, my marriage or my sex life or my career offend you in any way, then again, that's not my business, and you can make decisions that reflect like your beliefs, values, and boundaries as well, right? Like, I don't need everyone to love me. I think it was harder because my husband didn't make the decision, like, right? Like, he's not in the industry, never has been in the industry. He just fell in love with somebody that is in the industry, and my decisions have absolutely had an effect on his businesses and his relationships. And in the beginning, that sucked. Like, it sucks knowing that the things that I did have negative consequences for my loved ones. And I think you don't really understand the gravity of that decision, which, I mean, I got in at 21, which is still pretty young. You're not thinking about those things. You're not thinking, is this going to affect my future husband or wife, or if I have kids? I didn't think I was going to have kids. Like, my health wasn't in a place where I was told I could. So like, all of these things I didn't really consider. And I think that's the tough part, but I can't speak to like how he's processed it. I know that he's in a good place with it. 'Cause like, I'm pretty sure he would tell me, but, it certainly wasn't easy in the beginning, but I think the way that we look at it is it's a great filtration process, right? So if someone is so closed-minded, or they're going to write us off so immediately, then that's not someone that's for our tribe anyways, right? It's like, be curious and not judgmental. Like, what could you learn about someone if you approached it with curiosity instead of your judgments? You know what I mean? So I don't know. I think people have like their own relationship with sexuality, and there's a lot of inherent shame that's still attached to it. So then when they see someone expressing it so freely, it's almost like a direct threat to their way of being. And it's not. Like, I totally respect everyone's opinion on how they want to express themselves sexually. And I don't think that what's right for you is necessarily right for me, and vice versa.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a mirror of shame back for people, because when you're so open about something like sex, which is still amazingly in 2023 quite taboo in some cultures and nations and demographics, and it can be, as you mentioned, a mirror of shame back at somebody, and a lot of people will tend to project anything that's going on internal outwards onto whoever the vessel is that's mirroring that emotion back to them. And that brings me on to something that I'm very curious about, because you talk about motherhood insights and you have your 2 boys. And I'm very curious because this is a trend, and you've definitely seen this because I know you've talked about it on your podcast, that there's a world now that is starting to demonize men and how to raise masculine boys and getting in touch with that. And you do a lot of work with the divine feminine, so we are going to cover both sides here. But talk to us about raising masculine boys in a world that demonizes men, because I think this is useful for parents that have male children, but also for adult men, because it works all the way across the spectrum regardless of age. So can you talk to us about that?
So, I mean, there are so many ways that we are falling short with our children, and specifically boys. And obviously those boys, we hope, grow into confident, strong men. So first things first is there's no more rites of passage, because religion is dying, and we're not really replacing it with anything else that has that sense of community, and then that transition into manhood, right? Like, it's like we have this whole new animal, which is teenager, and that didn't used to exist. It was like you were a child, and then you would go and do your walkabout or your spirit quest, and you would be tried physically, mentally, emotionally, and you would come back as a man. Like, there wasn't this long lingering of kind of like this purgatory. So we kind of asked and demanded our young boys to step up a lot more than we do now. And I think that lack of purpose starts showing up in a lot of negative ways, right? Like, that's where you get violence and misogyny, and people that are all of these deaths of despair or diseases of despair, where you get depression and anxiety and like real disability to where you can't have a job. So I think that's step one. I think we also live in this place where, I mean, I'm sure you've seen all of the material where it's like the future is female. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? You're writing off half the population? How about like we're a team, and we're supposed to kind of work in tandem together. It's not this or that, it's both, right? So like that's also a pendulum swing in the wrong direction, in my opinion. So then that doesn't leave space for our boys. If our boys see stuff like that, well, what does that mean for me? If the future is female, what does that mean? Where's my place in all of that? So it's almost like we're kind of demanding that our men be weak and small in order to make room for women. And for me, that doesn't make sense. I don't know if you saw this trending picture that was going around social media, but it was these women standing around. It was obviously like a retreat of sorts. And there's these women standing around in a circle, and these men are bowing down at their feet. And the women are, have their heart over their hands over their heart. Some of them are sobbing. A lot of them are in like this very deep meditative space. And I can understand how an exercise like that could possibly be beneficial if done in the right space, with the right context, I don't know. I'm trying to like give it the benefit of the doubt. But if you look back at something like Robert Bly's book, Iron John, and they talk about finding the monster within yourself, taming that monster, being able to step into it, understand your power, and then control it, right? And then they say like, the key to your masculinity is underneath your mother's pillow. So it's like me allowing him to unleash that wild man inside, so that he can learn how to control it, so that if he needs to, when he needs to, he can step into that leadership, that protection, right? Like, he knows his strength. And then Jordan Peterson says this all of the time too, which is like, there's nothing more dangerous than a weak man. So when I see the men bending and bowing at a woman's feet, that doesn't make me feel safe. I don't want a man to make himself feel small in order for me to feel safe. What makes me feel safe is a man who steps into his strength, steps into his healed masculine, which is feeling, right? We still maybe have this idea that men aren't supposed to have emotions or feel or cry. That's not true at all. I think that there's a real beauty in a man being able to be vulnerable and emotionally vulnerable. And there's a difference between being a sobbing mess and not being in control of your emotions, or being able to show, I can show you love, but I can also lead, and I can also hold space for you. That makes me feel secure as a woman, not a man bowing at my feet. And it's almost like this retroactive apology for like the quote patriarchy. I don't want that either. My boys didn't do anything wrong. Are you a misogynist? Did you do anything against me as a woman? Why are you apologizing? So I don't believe in taking on other people's wrongdoings as your own collectively. That doesn't make sense to me either.
That's so powerful. And you mentioned there about the healed masculine. And I think that's something that I've definitely struggled with. You know, I think a nature of Irish culture, English culture, even more so than in the States, of just grin and bear it. Don't tune in with your feelings. Don't check in with emotions. And you mentioned there even an example of your husband when something's uncomfortable and he's like, I'm just going to sit with this and try and lean into this. Like, there's a lot of strength and power in that, as a male, being able to check in with, actually, this is making me really uncomfortable. What's the emotion that's being stirred up within me? And being able to sit with that, as opposed to numbing out or using distractions or sex, or, you know, this is a context where porn would be one of the potential ways that people can numb out, you know, a distraction technique. So in that context, it's not going to be very healthy. And I think that when you look at it that way, it's such a powerful approach for people that are listening to this that have male children, that have boys, or for men that are listening who are thinking, well, actually, I should probably over-index on this side because this is what society is telling me. And it comes back to what you mentioned earlier about the box and not being trapped in that box. Let's flip it to the other side then, the divine feminine, because I know you discussed this quite a lot. And this is something that I've only recently started to educate myself on. As someone with a daughter, my daughter's nearly 8, and I'm trying to just check in and tune in with these things now, because I know it's something that's going to be coming into my space a lot over the next 10 years or so. Talk to us about the divine feminine, in particular, learning to lead with softness, and we can go from there.
So this is coming from someone who has been in, like, I have let my masculine energy kind of lead me most of my life. So I think it ties back into what the healed masculine is, right? So the first love that a little girl has is her father. Like, that is the first real love that she experiences. And how he shows her love is teaching her what she should expect and demand in the future from men. So if you're not healed, like the healed masculine, if you're not providing that vulnerability and that love and care and that embrace for her, she's not going to know what that is. I didn't have that. So I didn't have a strong male role model that showed me what love, unconditional love was, or protection, or that foundation of safety. I never felt safe. So I had to provide that for myself. So I'm like, well, if that's, you know, no one is going to show up for me, I have to show up for myself. And that is exhausting. But a lot of women are there. I mean, you know, most men don't stay in the house. They don't help raise the children. Divorce rates are skyrocketing. So a lot of kids are raised without dads, which is devastating. And there's a huge impact on the kids and on the culture as a whole. So we have a lot of young women that feel like they have to be everything for themselves. They have to make all of the money themselves. They have to be this insane career woman. They also have to figure out how to balance family if that's what they want to do. And what ends up happening is that they don't leave enough space for like the man in their life. So they're like, if I'm doing all of these things and I don't need a man because I am this strong, capable, independent woman, like, where does he fit in? And then you end up finding that you start leading your relationships like a man. You end up being very aggressive, condescending, combative. Everything is something to be conquered, right? Like, there is just like this kind of armor that you have on yourself and this contraction that starts to happen. And I know, like, maybe this sounds woo. I don't know how much of your audience like gets into all of this stuff, but if you want to bring it down to maybe more of an understandable physical level. So if you go to a pelvic floor therapist as a woman, they can do biofeedback internally. And I would almost guarantee you that every woman that's leading with her masculine is going to experience some hypertension within like her cervix and within her vagina. And that's not good for you. That's going to lead to a lot of chronic pain, could lead to autoimmune issues flaring up, leads to inflammation. There's like a lot of health consequences that come from that feeling of not being safe. And when you want to tie it back to the spiritual element, like that's your root chakra, and your root chakra is the very foundation of safety. So how do you go from leaning from the masculine into the soft, surrendered feminine? You have to kind of tell yourself, like, I am safe. Am I safe, or am I not safe? Whichever way works for you. If you want to do a double negative, or if you want to do the affirmation, because there's like two different camps there. But check your surroundings. Is this person showing up for me? Is he loving me? Does he want to be there for me? And maybe you don't have a partner. Maybe you want to just do it like by yourself. Like, is the world around me inherently safe, or am I actually under attack? Because our body and our minds sometimes are in different places with that. And I know that was the case for me. So a lot of it is realizing, if I stop fighting, things become a lot easier. People are a lot kinder to me. Someone gave me the analogy, and it's like, you're protected in your vulnerability. So if you think about a baby, right? A baby doesn't need to protect itself. It quite literally can't protect itself. And it's in that vulnerability that everyone shows up to protect that baby. So that's how I kind of see the female energy, like the divine feminine. It's by being vulnerable, being soft, surrendering, all of these things, being open. Then you'll immediately kind of find that your circle, your tribe, the people around you step up. The world is now safer because you're expressing that vulnerability, just like that baby.
How did you go from 0 to 1 with that? And that's a fantastic line, that you're protected in your vulnerability. But there's a lot of women who listen to this podcast, and we have kind of a 50-50, 60-40 split. But it's high achieving women. It's women who are into sport, who are into fitness, who are into business, who take control, or are, some are breadwinners, primary breadwinners in their household. Not all, but some. Mm-hmm. And that fighting mindset and that default to that masculine energy fighting mindset is something that is default programming for a lot of people. And it sounds like you've reprogrammed or rewired that. But Candice, how did you go from 0 to 1 with that? What was your first step towards leaning into that protection through the vulnerability?
I'd ask, is it working for you? Are you exhausted? Are you tired? Are you in pain? Are you sick? Like, do you constantly feel like you're inflamed? Like, what is your body telling you? What is your mind telling you? And if it's not working for you, which I would imagine for most women it's not, it's like, wouldn't you like it to be easier? You can still have all of those things. You can still be a high achieving woman. You can still have a career. Like, I still am technically the quote breadwinner. Like, I make more than my husband. Like, that doesn't, that's not triggering to him. He doesn't give a shit. You know what I mean? It's our money. And he's secure in his masculine, that's not a threat to him. But it's been a lot easier since I've surrendered. So first, it's recognition. Like, do you want to continue on this path of having to like run through cement walls? Or what if I could tell you that you could still have everything that you want, but it would just come to you? So there's this idea that the divine feminine is the energy of creation, right? We create life. We quite literally create life. So with that energy, you can also manifest. So you don't have to work as hard as a quote, the divine masculine or a man. You can kind of get things a lot easier by surrendering. So just start with like small little tasks in maybe like a scenario where, let's say you're at a meeting and you would feel like you would have to step up and like do those, masculine poses that they tell you to do that don't actually work if you look at the research. Maybe try approaching it from like a softer perspective. Like, maybe talk a little softer, maybe be a little bit more open. Maybe don't challenge somebody at the meeting table and present something in a different way, and see how other people react to that. And like, you can treat your day like an experiment and just like keep tweaking it to something that makes sense to you. And you don't have to end up being like this puddle of a woman and just like let people walk over you. That's not what I'm saying. Like, you can still be like a fierce woman, but there's different ways to do it. And then there's different ways that people are going to receive that same energy. So treat it like an experiment. And then that's kind of how I did it. I was like, well, normally I would react this way. Normally I would like get loud and big and see how I can get my point across. But the softer I was with people in negotiating contracts, the more the more I would get out of the contract than if I was like fighting for my terms. So I would say just like start with little steps and then see where it goes. And then you'll start to feel safe and see the reaction that you want. And then again, it's less exhausting because you don't have to be everything for yourself. Everything will kind of show up for you, if that makes sense.
That go, attack, aggressiveness links in very heavily. When I think of that, I think of, for me personally, because you're literally connecting directly with me as kind of a past self, that was all ego. And I had to really work on that kind of dissolution of ego and lean into a softer side. And again, it's so funny, you're using divine feminine here, but I think this is equally applicable to men who need that kind of counterbalance, that yin and yang. Did you find that letting go of ego was something that helped you with that initially? Because I would imagine there's a voice in your head, well, again, I'm projecting now because this was my story, a voice in my head that would be like, no, you need to be hard, you need to be aggressive, don't be soft, people will take advantage. And you have this ego screaming in your ear. Did you find that you had to let go of any element of that, or was your process completely different?
So the way that I view ego is kind like, I don't think there's a letting go of it. I think as long as you're in the human body, you have an ego. There is no transcending it. There is no, like, you hear this thing, ego deaths, like, sure, maybe for like a minute, but then it's right back. You know what I mean? So anyone that tells you that they have conquered their ego, run away the other way, because it's very much there. If anything, I think the more work that you do, the more sneaky it gets, because now it has to learn these new tricks. And then you think that you have transcended it, and then you actually have this thing that's called a super ego. And then you see that with a lot of people that are recreational ayahuasca and psilocybin people, right? Like they're like the space cadets that have figured out the keys to the universe, and you better listen to them. So that's also a problem. For me, it's being able to see who's taking the wheel, right? So like, what is the reason I'm doing it? What's my why? When it comes to like the ego and tricky games, it's like, am I doing this for like the right reasons of like contribution or general interest or passion or authenticity? Or am I doing it for status and recognition and like followers and another zero in the bank account or whatever it is? Like these things that really aren't going to lead to any significant increase in happiness. So I think it's just being more aware of my own bullshit, you know what I mean? And realizing that I don't need to be like the number one podcast in the world. I don't need to have the most followers or the most engagement. Like what around me makes me happy, and invest energy into that. And then with that, it's like, again, when I wasn't in like a better place, because I'm not healed, and I hate that word, but I think we should always be growing. There's this quote, like, if you're not growing, you're rotting. So like, I want to constantly be growing and improving, even if it's like by a 0.01% a day, like whatever it is, am I like a tiny bit better the next day? I found that I was like competing with my husband for things. Like, what is that? We're teammates. You know what I mean? We're teammates. We're life mates. We're raising children together. Like, why am I in competition with him? So it's like, you should be in competition with like the older, worse version of yourself. So yeah, I think it's coming down to like being aware of your own bullshit and being very like radically honest with that, and not trying to run away, and like being like, okay, I see you, and I'm going to be different. I'm going to choose to grow in this moment. And there's nothing to be ashamed of, because nobody is perfect. And how can I do better? What is like a 0.01% thing that you can do to be better? And that's it.
Candice, with that older, worse version of yourself, what's something that you know now that you wish you had known 10 years ago?
That it doesn't have to be so hard, and that it's okay. It's going to be okay. I felt like, I mean, going back into that idea of not feeling safe and constantly worried, am I going to be able to have the life that I want? Am I going to find love? Do I deserve love? Am I going to have a family? Do I deserve a family? It's like this constant little voice in your head that says like, I am not enough. I am nothing. I am unlovable. Like all of these really insidious programs that have been put through, and again, a word I hate to use, but like there's no other word, is, you know, trauma, and having to unpack that, and, you know, psychedelics can be fantastic for that. Meditation can be fantastic for that. Finding your spirituality can be fantastic for that. We talked about losing the sense of community, which, you know, obviously hurts everybody. It's like, how can we commune again, right? Like, do you have close friends? Do you have really deep connections? All of these things really matter in how you show up to the world and how supported that you feel and how vulnerable that you can be. So when you're coming to this place where you constantly feel like you have to fight, again, if you show that vulnerability, you're kind of protected in it. And it's not to say if someone does something, you let them steamroll you. Absolutely not. But like, just like knowing that you can handle it, but also someone else is there for you. Like, you don't have to do it alone, right? Like, leave space for someone else to show up for you.
I'm very curious with sexuality in particular, because I know something else you talk about, and I mentioned I'll link the podcast so people can actually do a deep dive into your podcast off the back of this, the differences in sexuality between men and women. But something that I've always found as a massively underrated tool for self-discovery is fitness. So I've always used fitness, physical fitness. I used to do a lot of 100-mile ultramarathons, long distance runs, but I found that there was a self-discovery element, a very underrated tool to self-discovery, not dissimilar to what I got on psychedelic trips, just kind of a same up ladders up against the same wall, just a couple of levels down. When you think of underrated tools for self-discovery, do you think sexuality falls into that and just exploring your own sexuality, or would you say there's something else that you found has worked better? Because you obviously mentioned meditation there, psychedelics. I'm just curious to hear your take on that.
I think anything that leads to discomfort is something that you should just dive into, right? I think that is the quickest way to learn the most about yourself is, does this make me nervous? Good, do it. Like, that is a sign that that's the what's the quote? It's the obstacle is the way. So if something feels difficult, then that's a kind of an indication that that's the direction that you should be exploring. So, I mean, it could be anything, right? I think physical fitness is huge. People are doing like cold plunge. That's massive, really intense sauna, working out to like the brink of exhaustion where you're like, can I do one more rep? Like, what is my body capable of doing? Meditation is really similar, especially if you're a really kinesthetic person. So like me, I need to be moving all of the time. So for me to sit still with nothing else but my mind is really difficult. Like, it's really, really hard for me, and I still struggle with it. So lean into that difficulty. I think when it comes to public speaking, that's huge. I just did an event. Chris was actually there. It was in Miami with Pomp. And it was this panel, and I was terrified. I don't do panels. I don't do panels in front of hundreds of people. That's not my jam. I have a podcast. It's intimate. It's one-on-one, sometimes maybe two people, and that's it. So I was super nervous, and Pomp thought it was hysterical. And I'm like, I might be a fainting goat. Like, have you ever seen those goats that just freak out and faint? I might do that. I'm just letting you know. It'll be great for your YouTube channel. You can keep it. And he was like, you're ridiculous. Like, the things that make you nervous are ridiculous. Because I'm like, I would rather be on set right now. And he's like, I just don't comprehend that. So yeah, I think sexuality, because some people are still very uncomfortable with sexuality. I mean, you would be shocked, and I'm sure this isn't a man thing because you have to see it to pee. So like, you guys are very aware of your anatomy, but you would be shocked at how many women have never seen their parts. Like, they haven't seen their vulva or their vagina. Like, they haven't explored it at all. There's shame just in the existence of it, which is wild to me. So like, exploring your sexuality doesn't mean you have to put a camera on and have a production set or start an OnlyFans. Like, it can be intimate by yourself in the tub, whatever you want, but like, explore that. And I think that a lot of confidence and a lot of like really magical, creative, and like fierce energy. Like, you want to talk about strength, like that energy is magnetizing and it's really, really powerful. So yeah, explore that. If that's something you're nervous about, absolutely explore that and lean into it.
Yeah, I've definitely found that masturbation between the two, between men and women, is completely different. From the age of 11 or 12, men joke about it and they're very open about it. And women all the way up until their 20s and some even into their 30s and beyond still won't discuss it publicly. Do you find that that's one of the major differences in sexuality between men and women? Or are there other things that come to mind when you think of the main differences between both?
So men, we know are super visual, and which is why pornography is so big with men, and it's not really taking off with women. Women love erotica, so they love a story. They want the investment. They like to know that that night just slayed the dragon for them, and like their climax is riding off into the sunset. Like that's what gets them off. Even if you read, and most men don't do erotica, but if you do look at men, if you look at erotica that is written for men and women, that is even vastly different. Like the erotica for men is like very descriptive as to like the penis size and the action, and then the woman, it's like a lot more emotional. It's like he's showing up for you. So I think women really want that story. So I think that's why a lot of women are uncomfortable with pornography, is because they don't get it. They see it and they think it's very invasive, it's very vulgar, and they're like, this is degrading to women. I don't want my man watching that. But I would say I recommend this book to everyone. It's called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, and it's like the largest sex survey done ever. So it's like these two, like one guy's like a neuroscientist. They both worked at Google, and they compiled all of this data from online. And what you realize through that is that if you look at like gay pornography, so like guy on guy, it's shot almost exactly the same as guy on girl. So it's not misogynistic. It is just like the way that the male gets turned on. It's just like the male brain. It is like, how do I capitalize pleasure so that I can sell a product to a man? That's all that it is. So it's really not degradation. It's just like what turns on a guy. And it gets into like sperm wars and all of these things, like competition theory. And it gets into weird kinks and why men like big breasts and young women, why the MILF category is so big. It is just like a really fascinating book. And it kind of takes a lot of the stigma away from pornography. And it can make women, I think, a little bit more comfortable with their partners consuming it. Now, again, we talked about tailoring your relationship earlier on in the podcast. You're allowed to do that. But I would say almost every man watches porn, to the fact that they tried to do studies to see, are there negative consequences on the brain for men that consume porn versus men that do not consume porn. They cannot do the study because they cannot find a man who has not watched porn. So this is true. It is so you would need that control group if you wanted to show any kind of correlation, let alone possible causation. So knowing that is just the truth, do you want a partner that's going to be honest with you and you want a real relationship, or do you value lying in your feelings more? Right. And I know that sounds harsh, but for me and in my marriage, honesty is number one. Like that is paramount. And we can do that because he can trust that he can come to me with anything, and I'm going to hold the space, and our goal is aligned. Our goal is marriage, unification, till death do us part. Let's fucking fix this problem. It's not my emotions are going to take charge and I'm going to take everything away from him, change the locks. You'll see the kids every other weekend. Fuck that. Fuck that. Death to us part, matching burial plots. So like come to me with however you fuck up and we will fix it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I love that. And there's another book that I'd recommend. Actually, me and Chris were talking about it when he was on the podcast. The Evolution of Desire by Dr. David M. Buss is another fantastic one around the evolution of desire in both men and women, and very similar to what you mentioned there, the emotional attachment and I know it's evolutionary psychology, so there's no control group, so it's always going to be difficult, but there's some interesting theories in there that can be quite useful for people to kind of wrap their head around why men think this way for porn versus women. I just want to ask one last thing on that, because there's definitely people listening to this who struggle with porn in relationships, and I know you've covered this in depth on your channels, on social media, but this is funny because I've actually never experienced this firsthand. So I have to use my friends and people that are around me. I've never had a partner or a girlfriend or anyone that I've been with who's like, do not watch porn. We are breaking up if you watch porn. It was always like, yeah, go do your thing. It's fine. It's not affecting us. Doesn't affect our sex life. We're good. But I've literally heard conversations or had conversations with friends whose wife or girlfriend is like, porn is off limits. Like I literally have to hide and delete my history every time I go on in case she searches it. What are your thoughts in terms of how porn can potentially either help a relationship or even more so? And again, I don't want to go too far outside your circle of competence, Candice, but just from your own experience, for those women who are listening who have that closed mindset of no, porn equals bad. My husband, my man, my partner cannot watch that. What would you say to those people? And again, I have my own ideas on it and theories on it, but again, I'm just curious to hear your opinion.
So I used to be wildly jealous, like wildly. There was no one on this earth more jealous than me at one point. Like just the most unhealthy version of what I would expect from a partner. And it was unattainable. Like I would basically self-sabotage. It was so bad. So to anyone that is like, porn is absolutely off limits, cheating, I get you. I've been there. I hear you, girl. Like I understand that discomfort. What I would challenge you to do is really sit with why. And you're not going to come up with it in one meditation, 2, 3. It might take a really long time, but like really get down to the first principle of why it is that you are feeling those very strong, big feelings around entertainment, like that, because that's what it is, right? Like he's not going to go meet one of those girls, and he's not taking her to dinner. He's not going to leave you just because he watches a video with a blonde and you're a brunette. Doesn't mean he doesn't also find you attractive. Like he's with you because he loves and is attracted to you, period, right? We can notice beauty and still appreciate what we have. Like what you're asking is kind of for him to be lying. And again, like, do you value your feelings more than you value honesty? And if you're going to be with someone forever, like you have to really sit with that and make that decision. Like, do you want a partner that has to lie to you all the time? I know so many men that lie to their wives about everything because they can't go to the bar and have a beer because that's a problem. They can't go golf during the afternoon because that's a problem. Porn, that's a problem. So is masturbation off limits to your partner? Yes or no? Okay. Like, first of all, how emasculating is that you're now like trying to control your husband like you would control a child? That's not setting yourself up for success either. Because like, do you want a husband, wife, king, queen relationship? Like, are you treating him like a king or are you treating him like a child? If you are trying to control literally his body, that's pretty crazy. You're controlling his body and his mind and what he's allowed to consume. Like we talk about my body, my choice, you know, whatever that gets into, but like you're literally controlling your partner's body. That's really wild to me. There's a huge discrepancy between female sexuality and male sexuality when it comes to appetite, right? Like it's pretty stark. So whose end are we going to fall on? Are we going to fall on your end? Are we going to have sex twice a month because that's all you want to do? Or are we going to have sex twice a day because that's what he wants to do? Who decides whose appetite gets satiated, right? So I would rather my husband go watch a video if I don't want to do it, so I can go do my yoga or I can cook or take a nap. Like if he, right, I don't want to have to be that available to him all of the time. So how are you going to make up for that discrepancy? It's an honest question, right? If you're making all of these demands from him, how are you going to placehold those? Like, what are you going to do in replacement of that? And maybe like someone is going to get triggered by that, but you can't make all of the demands of him and then not show up yourself. And then are you also not allowed to watch rom-coms or romantic movies or read your 50 Shades of Grey? Because it's the same thing. When you watch a movie with Ryan Reynolds and you're like, why aren't you kissing me in the rain like that? Why don't you, why wasn't your proposal like that? Why aren't you buying me a cottage on a lake? Like all of those things, it's kind of the same as him saying like, why don't you let me do X, Y, and Z in bed? Right? Like you're kind of comparing your partner to a fictional scenario, and that's not okay on either end. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's radical honesty and it's going to be uncomfortable. But again, do you value honesty or your feelings more?
That's I think that's going to connect with everybody, Candice, because again, similar conversations, and unfortunately I've had myself in the past, where you're watching porn or you're watching entertainment in that variety and you're thinking, okay, well, why aren't we doing that? But that's the exact same as flipping it to the other side. Okay, well, if you're going to hold your wife or female partner to that, then you need to be doing what Ryan Reynolds is doing and kissing them in the rain and buying them a lake, and it's that.
Absolutely.
And I think that dialogue and just reframing that and rewiring the way people see that is, and again, very similar to what you said there about appeasing the appetites, that like sometimes you're just reframing the situations. You might not be initially happy with it, but when you close off your mind to any potential solution or any potential positives to it, you're trapped in that box, like you said, and then that's very difficult to get out to. So I think we've blown through a lot of those in today's podcast. Candice, I just have one final question, and before we get on to that, For everybody that's listening, I highly recommend they go and check out your podcast, Chatting with Candice. I will link that in the show notes for people. You also put up a lot of stuff from the podcast, the clips on social media through Instagram. I know you've got the 2 pages, so I'll link those. But for people that want to reach out to you, who want to connect, who want to listen, is the podcast the best place? Or any of those other links you want to do now or give now before we get into the last question, please do.
Yeah, chattingwithcandice.com has my podcast, my YouTube. All my socials are Candice Horbacz. My Instagram is Eva Lovia. Twitter, I'm on the most. So if you find me on either of my Twitter accounts, that's where I spend probably too much time.
Amazing. Candice, I'm going through your podcast at the minute. I'm in the middle of the episode with Matthew Hussey, and I love the episode with Gad Sad, and there's a few other ones where I'm just kind of making mental nuggets as I go along. I really like, as I mentioned, and people will know from listening to this and from a separate introduction, your perspective and your take on things, because I get so much value from that. So I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. But with your podcast, in the last 6 months or so, 3 to 6 months, what was there, and I'm sure there was lots of these moments, but was there anything in recent memory that made you think, aha, and it flipped your perspective? And if so, can you tell us what episode that was? And I'll be sure to link it in the show notes as well.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's a really great question. I would say probably with Matthew Hussey, because we just did that, so that's kind of the top of my mind. I don't know if it was on the episode that he did for my show or if it was the one that I did for his, but we were talking about the idea of what constitutes a failure in a relationship or a marriage, and he was saying, like, try to reframe it. So I was saying, well, my parents were married for 15 years, but then they divorced. So obviously, like, that's not a great example. And he's like, why are you chalking up 15 years automatically to a failure, right? 15 years is substantial. And we don't necessarily have to say because it ended that it was automatically bad or we failed, right? Like we probably learned a lot and grew a lot within that relationship. Now, obviously, there's a difference between like a healthy, happy 15 years and a very chaotic, problematic 15 years. So you have to take that into consideration. But it's not to automatically ascribe something as like a failure, right? So we're so quick to do that to ourselves and to write ourselves off. So maybe like try to see the light and the good and the growth in situations.
Yeah, I think that mindset of failure is feedback in nearly every situation, whether it worked out intentionally in the way that you wanted and designed before you started, or whether it's taking out the nuggets of gold so that you don't make the same mistakes going forward. I think that rewiring of failure is key. Candice, I absolutely love the work that you're doing. I'm so grateful that you're putting it out there. I'm so glad we got to have this chat. And for everybody listening, I highly recommend, as I've said already, go and check out the podcast, start to connect in more with that divine feminine, the motherhood insights that we touched on here. I think there's so much that I get personally, so I think I'm going to call to action for both genders. Well, again, for several genders, depending on how we're labeling it, but in terms of people listening, I highly recommend they check it out regardless of where they fall on the spectrum. Candice, thank you so much for your time, for this wonderful conversation, and I look forward to hearing from you and chatting to you soon.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful. It was so nice meeting you.
There you have it, former adult star Candice Horbacz on connecting with your divine feminine, dealing with relationship insecurities, and not letting society put you into a box. As I mentioned in the introduction, I got so many aha penny drop moments from this conversation, and it's one that I'm going to go back and listen to again and start pulling on the thread of some of the things that we talked about in today's episode. Candice is doing fantastic work. As I mentioned, her podcast, Chatting with Candice, goes very deep on the topics that we covered in today's episode. So if it's something that you think you'll get more benefit from, I highly recommend checking that out. Also, if you are on my email list, every Thursday, I send out my top 3 takeaways from that week's episode. So I'm going to really enjoy looking into this episode and thinking about what were the main things I got from it personally. So if you want to sign up for that, just head over to the website and join the newsletter, or the link is in my description in Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and the quick links, and you'll get that every Thursday. But this, if you're listening to this at the time of recording or any time before the Thursday that it goes out, it'll be in your inbox on Thursday. That's everything from me from today's podcast. Catch you all next Monday.